So out of all the things that Jesus was criticized for during his ministry, if I'm honest, if this feels like the pettiest one, and this seems silly, almost bordering on ridiculous. I mean, don't get me wrong, I understand why Jesus was criticized a whole lot. I mean, Jesus was an incredibly controversial guy, especially from the perspective of a first century Jewish religious person. That's because the first century Jewish religious person came from a faith that saw God and saw God's people in a very specific way. And that way was Jewish. So when Jesus comes along and includes people in his ministry and in his teaching and in his preaching and in his miracles that are not Jewish, and he says that God is here to bless those people as much as he ever was the nation of Israel, well, that can be upsetting. That can be disheartening. That can be confusing. And when Jesus comes along and he explains that God is not a tribal God, he's not just the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, he is the God of everybody. Well, again, that is very disconcerting. I totally, completely understand sometimes why Jesus is criticized, especially by the religious leaders of Israel and people who are very committed to a certain way of looking at God and his people. Jesus was incredibly controversial. I'm not saying, of course, that they were right to criticize him. I'm going to take the side of Jesus, but I get it. But in this case, if I'm totally honest, I have a really hard time understanding. Because this doesn't seem important at all. This seems incredibly mundane and ordinary. This seems completely silly. So what happened was this. Jesus one day was in Jerusalem with his disciples, his best friends. And the Pharisees and the other religious leaders of the law of Moses came to meet with Jesus. Now, we don't know what the meeting was about. Maybe it was going to be friendly. Maybe it was not going to be friendly. We don't really know. Because the meeting doesn't happen. Because when the religious leaders got to see Jesus, they found something to criticize. Jesus and his disciples were eating a meal, and the Pharisees and the religious leaders realized that Jesus' disciples were not all following their rules about what it is you do in order to eat. They had come up with this intricate system of hand washing and washing of cups and dishes and things like that. And to us, that sounds totally normal. I mean, you wash your hands before you eat, especially you do the dishes after you eat and before. But this wasn't about hygiene. This wasn't about being clean. This was about a religious concept. This was about coming up with a rule in order to follow it, so that way you were doing something for God that you were making up. And Jesus' disciples were not doing the rules. They were not following the eating laws, for lack of a better term, of the Pharisees and the religious leaders. Now, that's not to say that they all weren't. I mean, we're told that some of them were not actually doing the hand washing and the dishwashing, and some of them, I guess that means were, which means Jesus had left it totally up to them. He wasn't treating it like a law at all. He was seeing it as optional. And I'll be honest, it's hard for me to understand why this was a big deal, why this would make people mad, but that's what happened. The Pharisees and the other religious leaders came to Jesus, and they did that thing that religious folks love to do anytime they disapprove of something. They don't just come out and say, hey, what you see you doing is wrong. That would be too simple. What people love to do is they like to ask a question that's not really a question. In this case, they asked a question. They said, hey, Jesus, why are your disciples not following the precious laws that we all follow about hand washing and dishwashing before they eat? That was their way of letting Jesus know that they saw him and they disapproved. It wasn't really meant for an answer, though. And so Jesus didn't give them one. He saw their criticism for what it was, and he answered in kind and simply explained to them that he thought they were hypocrites for asking him why they weren't following these laws. After all, they weren't all that good at following God's laws in the first place. So why were they making up new laws and new rules on top of the ones of God that they weren't good at? This did not make them happy, but Jesus really doubled down on it. And he decided to tell the people something that really made the Pharisees and the religious leaders angry. He called all these people together, and that's something that happened. Wherever Jesus is, there's a crowd. Whatever the Pharisees are, there's a crowd. Especially when you put those together, there's a crowd. They didn't have TV. They didn't have internet. They didn't have a lot going on, so they would just kind of come and watch. And so Jesus calls all the crowds together, all the people. And he says, listen up, everybody. I want you to know that what you put into your body, what you eat, it does not defile you. You are not made unclean by the food that you eat. Now, for us, that is not anything that should be controversial. Because we understand that what people eat, the food that they eat, is really kind of a personal preference. I mean, you might not eat certain things because of an allergy, like mushrooms or bread or something. You might get rid of those out of your diet because it hurts you, and nobody should give you any grief for that. It's just how your system works. There's some people are vegetarians and vegans, and sometimes people freak out because somebody is like that, and they've chosen not to eat meat, and they make jokes about them, and they really get hostile. And if you're that person, don't be that person. Nobody likes that person. But other than that, we basically understand that, what you eat is your own business. And yet Jesus told them that what they eat does not defile them. He didn't mean that in a way that was physical. Obviously, anybody who's eaten Taco Bell knows it can defile you physically. But Jesus was talking in a spiritual sense. And in a spiritual sense, saying that something does not defile you that you eat, it doesn't make you unclean, that to us is not a big deal. It's hard for us to understand why someone would be mad about that. But it wasn't just the Pharisees who were mad about that. As we read later on in the passage, as we read in the Gospel according to Mark during this story, we read that Jesus' own disciples also really struggled with this concept. Here's what we read in Mark chapter 7. We read, then Jesus went into a house to get away from the crowd. By the way, it's one of those moments in Jesus' ministry when I see him and I relate to him so well. I love being around people, but sometimes you just got to get away from them. And so Jesus does that. As Jesus went into a house to get away from the crowd. And then we read that his disciples asked him what he meant by the parable that he had just used. Don't you understand either? Jesus asked them. Can't you see that the food you put into your body cannot defile you? Because food does not go into your heart, but only passes through the stomach and then goes into the sewer. And then Mark clarifies. By saying this, he declared that every kind of food is acceptable in God's eyes. Now, Mark's wording of the disciples' question about the food, I think is really telling about what they were upset about, too. You see, they asked Jesus, hey, that whole defile thing, you saying, that it's not really something that makes you unclean if you eat it, and about food, that no food is defiling. They asked Jesus what he meant by that parable. A parable is an allegorical story. It's something non-literal. It's something that doesn't mean what it means at face value. And you see, the disciples were so committed to their understanding of God, to their understanding of the law, to their understanding of dietary restrictions, that no, they may not have followed exactly what the Pharisees had said about washing your hands and washing the cups. But Jesus had gone so far the other way, saying that no food actually can make a person unclean, which completely contradicts and breaks the law of Moses when it comes to what you can and cannot eat, that they assumed that Jesus must be speaking in allegory and metaphor. They assumed that he had to be speaking a parable. They just couldn't accept it at face value. And yet Jesus wanted them to. You see, Jesus told them, really in no uncertain terms, this was simply the physical reality he was talking about. He actually talks about that when you eat food, it goes into the sewer, which, yes, absolutely is a reference to digestion and having to poop. And so Jesus, it's almost borderline ridiculous that Jesus has to say this. It's borderline ridiculous that Jesus does say this, but it's unmistakable and undeniable that Jesus is getting them to understand, yeah, guys, I am talking talking about this in a physical, literal sense. What you eat is in your body and then it goes away. It's not part of you. And because of that, Jesus did not understand the dietary laws of the law of Moses as being laws he needed to follow. He said that all food is clean, that keeping kosher, as we might call it today, or following the exact recipes that you see in the Bible, that's completely unnecessary. To God, it simply does not matter. All food is clean food. Jesus broke the law when it came to what you eat. And again, to us, I got to tell you, it can be hard for us to understand why they would get mad. Of all the things Jesus said, I mean, we talked last week in last week's sermon about Jesus telling the disciples that they needed to love their enemies and pray for those who persecute them. And even though the law said that you can have an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth and a life for a life, that you can get back at the people who hurt you, even though that's what the law says, Jesus says, don't do that. We don't see in the Sermon on the Mount that the disciples raise their hands and say, Jesus, but that can't be true. That must be a parable or an allegory, because you can't literally mean something so ridiculous. And yet, when it comes to this, the food they ate, in the way that they ate it, well, it was just so ridiculous to them. And I have to wonder, why? But you see, it wasn't just the Pharisees, and it wasn't just the disciples who struggled with this. This is something that we see struggles within the early church. Fast forward 30 years, the Apostle Paul is writing to a church in Colossae. And he writes to them this about the way that they eat and the way that they act as Christians. And we read this in Colossians chapter 2. The Apostle Paul says, don't let anyone condemn you for what you eat or drink, or for not celebrating certain holy days, or new moon ceremonies, or Sabbaths. For these rules are only shadows of the reality yet to come. And Christ himself is that reality. A little later he says, you have died with Christ. He has set you free from the spiritual powers of this world. So why do you keep on following the rules of the world? Like, don't handle, don't taste, don't touch. Such rules are mere human teachings about things that deteriorate as we use them. These rules may seem wise because they require strong devotion, pious self-denial, and severe bodily discipline. But they provide no help in conquering a person's evil desires. Now, Paul's comments really echo Jesus's, even down to the whole sewer thing. I mean, if you notice in the passage, Paul says that these things deteriorate as we use them. He's clearly talking about, when you eat, it's temporary. And so he says, don't worry about what other people say about the foods that you eat. Whatever you eat is fine. But you also see in this passage how people felt about that. People didn't just criticize other people for what they eat, they condemned them. Paul saying, don't let someone condemn you, means someone wants to condemn them. Paul says that when people follow rules like don't handle, don't taste, don't touch, don't eat certain foods, that people think that's wisdom. If you know anything about the Hebrew concept of theology and throughout the Old Testament, wisdom is the most incredible thing that they're looking for. And they think that wisdom is in not eating certain foods. He says that it requires strong devotion, pious self-denial, severe bodily discipline. People were working hard to not eat certain things. This is 30 years after Jesus says all foods are clean. You can break the law. I'm breaking the law. It's totally fine. Don't worry about the way that we eat. Don't worry about the things that you eat. All food is clean. 30 years later, within the church, Paul is talking to Jewish Christians who are clearly worried about what they're eating and what other people will think, and will they be condemned? I just can't get it. I mean, at least at first, looking at this, I don't understand. Maybe it's a cultural thing. Maybe it's just a common sense thing. Maybe it's just the way we look at things versus the way they look at things, maybe. But at first glance, I just don't get it. I get, okay, maybe the Pharisees are just nitpicking at Jesus, okay. Maybe the disciples are just confused. That happens. Maybe the early church doesn't quite understand how to live out the gospel in the world they live. Okay, that's something that's also true. But to put all those together, and the common link is this food thing. You know, of all the laws that we have talked about during this series, we will talk about this series, this feels to me like the most innocuous one. Eat what you want. That's fine, is the way I would think. And so the question we have to ask is, why was it such a big deal? Why? Why did they care so much, from the Pharisees to the disciples to the early church 30 years later? Why did they care so much? Now, honestly, I can't go back in time. I can't go ask them. So I don't know that I can exactly say this. But the good news is there are people today who follow kosher eating laws, who follow the Jewish Old Testament ways of looking at food. By the way, most of the time this is Jewish people, but sometimes this is even Christian folks. And so the good news is we can ask them why they do it. What is so good about kosher eating? And maybe that will give us the answer that we're looking for. Maybe that will help solve this mystery as to why it's such a big deal. So that's what I did. As I was looking at this sermon, as I was preparing for this sermon, I decided to look up what Jewish people tell about their own kosher practices, why they do what they do. And I came across a few different reasons. So one reason that people will keep kosher today and follow Jewish dietary restrictions is simply a matter of hygiene. You know, they decided that the Bible teaches, and it's not that they've decided, but they've seen in nature and also what the Bible teaches, that some animals are clean animals and some animals are not clean animals. And I can totally get that. You know, probably the most famous example is you've got pigs, and pigs are unclean, so you're not supposed to have a pork chop or bacon or pulled pork barbecue or whatever. And I totally get that. I watched a documentary a while back, or maybe it was a news report, about this woman in another country where she had thought that she had this tumor in her brain, and turns out that she had this worm that had burrowed into her head because she'd eaten some undercooked pork. I'll be honest, if you get, the trichinosis worm, you might also say that, hygienically, let's not eat pork, and, the Bible tells us, not to do that, so let's listen to the rest of it too. Totally get that. At least in part. Another reason is sort of a moral issue. As it turns out, a lot of kosher concepts of eating is not so much even just what animals are eaten, but how the animals that are eaten are killed. And this, again, I totally get. We want to do this as humanely as possible. Listen, I'm not one of those PETA, meat is murder people, although that's great if you are. But for me, that's not where I'm at. But I am here. I one time went hunting for deer, and it was one time because when I was there, I realized I didn't want to shoot Bambi because they're really cute and adorable, and I don't want to kill something. So I just prayed the whole time for God to keep the deer away. And in case that God, didn't want to answer my prayer, I went ahead and made sure that I made a lot of noise, which means the person I was with, they don't want to take me anymore. The point is, I'll be honest, I don't want to kill anything. And so if I did have to kill something, I totally understand the whole let's do that humanely idea. I totally get that one as well. Additionally, there's a cultural reason. This one's harder for me to understand as an American. My culture comes from this melting pot, hodgepodge, potpourri idea where we just kind of throw everything in a blender and what pops out we like. But for a lot of people, what they eat is part of their heritage. It's what their grandfather did. It's what their grandfather's grandfather did. It's what their grandfather's grandfather's grandmother taught their whole generations of people to do. I totally can at least cognitively understand why that would be important to people. And maybe finally, there's a fourth reason that just simply the Bible tells us so. If you believe in the Scriptures, if you believe in the God of the Scriptures, it doesn't matter if God told us the reason to follow or not. For a lot of people, it's just that simple. God said these foods are good and these foods are not. And especially if you just sort of don't take into consideration Jesus' words on it, well, then it's totally fine just to do that. So as I was looking at these answers, I was looking at what people did. I'll be honest, I thought that a lot of them were great. A lot of them were good answers. But if I'm doubly honest, I don't know that I found a reason for people to be so mad. I mean, if that's all it is, if it's just, the pigs are a little bit dirty or whatever, and, we want to make sure the animals are killed in the right way, and also the Bible tells us to, and it's a cultural thing, I understand why that would be important to people, but I don't understand why that would make people like the Pharisees and the disciples and the early Christians so much angrier at Jesus than other stuff he said. And that's when I ran across a particular rabbi who explained the kosher rules in a different way that helped me understand. You see, this particular rabbi explained that eating kosher is not about what you don't eat. There's not really a virtue in not doing something. That's so often we think ethics are about not doing bad things. But while you shouldn't do bad things for lots of reasons, that's not what makes us virtuous. That's not what makes us righteous. Righteousness comes from doing positive things. And according to this rabbi, kosher eating is truly about eating in a positive way that connects us to God. You see, to the person who's eating kosher, a meal is not just a meal. A meal is an act of devotion to God. A meal is an act of worship to God. That every time they eat, as they eat the food directed that they're supposed to eat, not worrying about what they're not supposed to eat, but eating what they are supposed to eat, that helps them to mindfully recognize that there is more in this world than just food. There is more in this world than our physical needs and our physical communities, but there is God, there is his love, there is a heavenly and a spiritual community, and it is that community that we are called to follow and serve and love and promote. The kingdom of God is reminded to us as we eat, says this rabbi. Kosher eating makes a meal not just a meal, but an act of worship. And when I look at it like that, okay, yeah, I get it. Because, if every time I eat food, breakfast, lunch, dinner, every time, 3 meals a day for 7 days a week, for 365 days a year, if that's what I'm doing, then for Jesus to come along and say, all food is clean. Don't worry about dietary restrictions. Don't worry about the law of Moses. Don't worry about what's in the scriptures. Well, Jesus is taking the foundation away of an act of worship. I can totally get why the Pharisees would say, why are you doing that? I can totally understand why the disciples would say, this must be a parable. I can completely understand why the early church assumes that it is wisdom to keep this worship there. So having said that, I guess I have another question. I guess I'm not wondering so much now why they were mad, but now I'm wondering why Jesus took it away at all. If it is an act of worship, why does Jesus not want people to worship? Why wouldn't he not just say, hey, cool, kosher eating is awesome, everyone should do it? I think the answer to that is found in another passage of Scripture by the Apostle Paul, written to another church. Here's what we read. In Ephesians chapter 4, starting in verse 5, we read, Paul saying, there is one Lord, one faith, one baptism, one God and Father of all, who is over all, in all, and living through all. A little later in verse 10, he says, Christ is the one who ascended higher than all the heavens, so that he might fill the entire universe with himself. According to Paul, Jesus is in all things. He has filled the universe, all of creation, with his own presence. He is there with us in all that we do, in all that we say, in all places that we go. He is in all, through all, over all. What that means for us is as we look at Jesus Christ, as we look at the God of the Scriptures revealed to us by Jesus Christ, the exact representation of our Creator, what we're faced with is this idea that Jesus is bigger than any one people. Jesus is bigger than any one culture. Jesus is bigger than any one even religion or expression of worship or religious denomination. That stuff that Jesus said that was sort of infuriating to people, how God is not just the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, that God was not just the God of the Jews only, well, that's all true. Jesus is bigger than any one group. We all belong to Christ, and Christ belongs to us all communally as people. We are individually vessels of God's Spirit. We are communally as a people vessels of God's Spirit. We belong to him, and he belongs to us. And that's amazing. And what that has to do with food is this. You see, I think a lot of times people mishear Jesus. When Jesus says that all food is clean, what they hear actually is no food is clean. They hear that kosher no longer is valid. And I don't think that's what Jesus was saying. I think what Jesus was saying was that stuff with kosher. You know, that act of worship, what the rabbi said about how there's this act of devotion and worship as we eat, as we connect to God, as we mindfully live a life of service and gratitude to God, that for them it only came through eating kosher. And what Jesus is saying is that worship, that mindfulness, that beauty, that grace, that gift of God is not just in kosher eating, it's in every eating. It doesn't matter whether you were eating kosher or you were eating delicious garbage from Taco Bell. If you eat and you eat mindfully, worshiping God, then no meal is just a meal. To the pure, all things are pure. It has to do with our hearts. It has to do with why we eat, how we eat, what we eat. And now that I've said all of that, I got to be honest, this is not a sermon about food at all. You see, because if Christ is over all and in all and through all, this concept of as we eat food, something so basic, something so ordinary, something so mundane, that even that is an act of worship. Well, the truth is, then anything can be an act of worship. To those of us whose hearts are right with God, as we are living mindfully in appreciation to God, there is no everyday. There is no random event. There is no insignificant moment. There is no just a Tuesday or just a Thursday. There is no just a Saturday. There is no just an anything. Because every day has meaning when we mindfully live our lives in appreciation for God. Jesus broke the law. He kicked down the door and said that what this gift that the Jewish people have enjoyed, it's open to everybody. It's not wrong. He didn't say no foods are clean. He said all food is clean. And so for you and I, Jewish or not, kosher or not, in all that we eat, in all that we do, we can know and worship God. This morning, this evening, tonight, we're in our third week of our series called The Laws Jesus Broke. And as we look at how Jesus reinterpreted and redefined and relooked at the gospel through the lens of the law, we're faced with the fact that Jesus did a lot of things different. And this morning, tonight, this evening, our third lesson about the laws that Jesus broke as we look at dietary restrictions is this. Insignificant meals and moments do not exist because Christ has filled all creation with himself. Let me say that again. Insignificant meals and moments do not exist because Christ has filled all of creation with himself. And what that means is when you and I sit down and eat a meal, it is not just a meal. It is an opportunity for us to mindfully be reminded of who God is, how we know him, how we connect to him, and that we can live out an appreciation of and in promotion of his kingdom. But you know what? This isn't about food, like I said. This is about everything. And you see, it doesn't matter whether we're eating a meal or whether we're watching a baseball game or a basketball game, or whether we're playing a board game with our friends, whether we're at a barbecue, whether we're taking our dogs for a walk, or whether we're out in the woods, or whether we're having a beer with our buddies, or whether we're just home on the couch with our family, or whether it's just a lazy day at home sleeping in till noon, or whether it's a beautiful day on vacation or a dreary day at work. It doesn't matter. All things belong to Christ. In all things, Christ is found. And what matters to us is where our hearts are. Can we find Christ in all of our circumstances? Can we find the Lord who is over all, in all, and living through all, truly in all? You see, that's what kosher eating is all about, is taking food, something so mundane, and devoting it to God as an act of worship. You and I, it's the same thing, because a meal is not just a meal, a day is not just a day, a week is not just a week, a year is not just a year, a life is not just a life when it is lived for God, because it is always significant, it is always beautiful, and it is always lived in appreciation of a God of love who transcends any law, and instead offers us his life and his grace as a gift. You see, that's what Christianity is all about. So if you want to eat kosher, have at it. Wonderful. You want to have a pork chop with some shrimp, with some cheese on top and a glass of milk next to it? Have at it. Wonderful. No matter what, Christ is always there. No matter who we are, Christ is always there for us. No matter what's going on, our lives can be lived and should be lived, most beautifully are lived, in appreciation to who God is. That's going to wrap this up. Ashland Christian Church, we have service each and every week at 10 o'clock. You are always welcome, no matter who you are, and we will always be glad to see you. Talk to you soon.